So I will use a writer.println even for this one. Init parameter has the default username as ServletConfig. But since this is I don't have to use this, just mention that for illustration. Okay, so now we are printing this init parameter as well. Again, the advantage of this is I'm declaring this upfront, and this can be used anywhere in the class, in the do get or the do post or anywhere, no matter whatever the value has been passed by the request, for that particular method. So now save this. Let me run this class. Okay, now it's refreshing. Okay, so the request parameter is null because we are not passing anything. The session parameter is null because we haven't set it there. Context parameter is null because we have set it. The init parameter, no matter what we use, the first execution onwards, you will see the value is what we have set. So this is the way you configure init parameters in annotations. You can also do that in a XML configuration. You say we were using the web.xml to configure the servlet. Then this would be our servlet configuration. So where we define the servlet, we give it a name. Inside the servlet node, we have a servlet name and a servlet class. We went to see this. So along with that, inside the same servlet node, we need to have an init param node, and inside that we have a param name, which is the name of the parameter, and the param value, which is the default value. So I can have as many parameters as I want, but again, this is tied to a servlet, and when the servlet's init method runs, this is passed as a ServletConfig to the init method, and then it's saved as a member variable inside the class. So our class can then access it whenever we want, and we can use the value. So again, a quick summary of init. Takes a ServletConfig parameter. This is available in the generic servlet implementation. You can add initialization code by overriding the init inside your class, but make sure that if you're overriding the init which takes the ServletConfig parameter, make sure that you're setting the ServletConfig parameter into your config member variable. This is a per servlet configuration, so whatever value you specify is applicable only for that server. But the advantage is, no matter where in the code you are using those values, it will be available because you know that when the object is initialized, it is set in the config member variable of the servlet class. And as we saw, we can configure the parameters either using annotations or in web.xml. So we need to specify the corresponding syntax in the annotations, which is init parameters and then web init parameters, or in web.xml we have the param name and the param value inside the init param node. And then finally, we also saw that there is another init method without any input parameters that we can use for overriding. So if we are overriding the init, we don't have to set the member variable as the inputs of that config parameter that we would have to do if we were overriding the other one, which actually takes the ServletConfig parameter. So if at all we are overriding the init, it's better to override this one, so that the ServletConfig parameter is already accepted by the previous method, which takes that as a parameter and then it sets it as a member variable. So in our init method that we override, the ServletConfig will be available in the member variable, and we can use that in the init method itself. Then we also had a look at the service method. The service method is overridden at the HTTP servlet for our HTTP purposes, And the whole role of the service method is to analyze the input request that it's getting and check what kind of a HTTP request it is. Is it a GET request or a PUT request or a delete or a post or whatever? So depending on the request, it calls the corresponding method, which is the doGet or the doPost and so on, to handle that request. So we do have an implementation of this service method in the generic servlet itself, but since the generic servlet is not specifically concerned about the HTTP protocol, it deals with a generic request and a response. But then in the HTTP servlet, it overrides this method and then casts those request and response to HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response, and calls the corresponding doGet or a doPost method with these parameters, which is the HTTP servlet request and the HTTP servlet response, so that when we override those doGet and doPost methods, we have those HTTP request and response objects as parameters. So yes, it decides which method to be called, and if we do not override that particular method in our servlets, then the HTTP servlet has code to throw an unsupported exception, so that we get an error saying this method has not been implemented in the servlet itself. So this covers the first set of tutorials on servlets. In our next tutorials, we're going to start looking at JSPs. And the reason why we look at servlets first before we try to learn JSPs is that there is, an understanding of servlets is required to understand JSPs, and most of JSPs actually eventually translates to servlet understanding anyway. So thanks for watching, and see you in the next tutorial.